Hello marine biology students. In this video we're going to start talking about ecology of marine systems. So this week we're going to talk about ecology and a bit about the intertidal and estuaries as well. So what is ecology? Well, ecology is the interaction between organisms and their environment. These interactions affect the survival and distribution of organisms in their environment. And these interactions can be very complex. As we're about to start discussing ecology in more detail, it would be helpful to have a shared list of terms and to know the definition of these terms. So the first is population. A population is a group of individuals of the same species living together in the same place at the same time. It is assumed that a population will have genetic exchange and that the offspring of this population will represent the general genetic makeup of the parents. The next term to know is the community of an area. A community is made up of all the populations of organisms of different species living in a defined area. So community is when you have organisms of different species interacting with each other. The term habitat is simply the physical place where an organism lives. And then lastly, when we talk about all of the resources, both living and non-living, biotic and abiotic, that an organism uses for survival, growth, and reproduction, we call that its ecological niche. So populations. Populations are the smallest biological units that can evolve. Populations are groups of organisms of the same species, and populations require specific resources to survive. These resources can affect population growth. If they are in short supply, and resources that affect the growth of a population are called limiting resources. Now, there are many things that a population needs to survive, and it could be that there's such an abundance of some of these resources that even if its total amount is cut in half, that's not going to change how the population is able to grow. So we wouldn't consider those limiting resources. But if there are other resources that if this population is experiencing competition, if it has to work to get these enough resources from, say, maybe a different species or different population entirely, and its growth is affected if it's not able to get those resources, those are the types of resources we're talking about when we say limiting resources. And a variety of different things can be limiting resources. This can include food and nutrients. It could be physical factors, such as light, salinity, or even just surfaces or substrate to live on. It could simply be space or habitat. Different gases, such as oxygen or carbon dioxide. Limiting resources can also include things like parasites and other symbionts. So an excess of parasites could limit growth, or an absence of essential symbionts could also limit growth. These are all factors which can control the growth of a population. And in this diagram, we can see exponential growth of dinoflagellates. If there is not a lack of any of these limiting resources, then reproduction and population size increase can happen, often in an exponential manner. However, eventually, a population is going to meet some sort of limit. Even if a population is not checked by a limiting resource, there is a maximum number of individuals that any habitat can support. And this number is known as the carrying capacity of that habitat. As populations become more crowded, the growth rate of that population will decrease. And here in this diagram, we can see how the growth of a population of dinoflagellates changes over time, but it can only approach carrying capacity, and as it approaches carrying capacity, the rate of population growth slows down. Through this and future lectures, we're going to talk about the different ways that species can interact with each other. This can be through competition, where they are competing for resources. This could be through direct predator-prey interactions, where one organism is feeding on another. Or it can also be through symbiosis, where the organisms are living together. Now, symbiosis does also include certain types of parasitism, so it's not always only beneficial. So we'll start by discussing competition. Competition occurs when two different populations use the same limiting resources that they both require for survival. Organisms can compete with members of their own species, which is known as intraspecific competition. Or they may be competing with members of other species, and this is called interspecific competition. An interspecific competition, again, is that competition against organisms of different species. So here we see an example of intraspecific competition. These two hermit crabs are competing for snail shells in their environment to use as their homes. This particular example of competition is quite fierce, as clearly one of these two competitors has lost a leg in this conflict. The number of available snail shells in this environment is a limiting resource, and it's often these limiting resources that drive competition. An organism can use a resource at the expense of another organism, meaning by using that resource, one individual or even one population will thrive, and the other will be limited because of it. This may result in reduced ability of that individual or even population to reproduce or even survive. Poorer competitors may die out due to this competition. Interspecific competition is when individuals of different species compete for the same resources, whether they're competing for food or space or some other limiting resource. Now, the outcome of interspecific competition is either that one species excludes the other, meaning they simply outcompete them. The lacking species or the less competitive species is just not able to get enough of that resource that it needs to survive. Or they coexist. They coexist by sharing a resource, by becoming specialized. So there's resource partitioning, or these populations start using different aspects of that resource. And some can even change, either starting to eat a different food or feeding at different times. By specializing and partitioning this resource, it can allow species that otherwise were in direct competition to now coexist. So we're next going to discuss different methods of symbiosis, or living together. The prefix sym means together, and bio refers to life. So living together. And examples of symbiosis can include mutualism, meaning both species benefit. Examples include cleaning associations on coral reefs, or zooxanthellae living within coral polyps themselves. Symbiosis doesn't always have to be endosymbiosis, but endosymbiosis, or organisms living within the bodies of other organisms, can happen. Commensalism is another way that organisms can interact. In commensalism, one species seems to be receiving benefit, whereas the other species isn't particularly harmed or negatively impacted, but they aren't specifically receiving benefit. An example of this are barnacles living on whales. And as we can see in this picture, there are several barnacles living on the mouth of this whale. Those barnacles are getting a free ride. They're also being exposed to fresh water and filter feeding, whereas the whales, they don't really get much out of this. So this is an example of commensalism. But with that said, the whales aren't necessarily harmed either. The last category of symbiosis that we'll talk about is parasitism. Parasitism is a form of symbiosis in which one species receives benefit, and this does happen at the expense of the host. So examples, tapeworms within the guts of whales. The tapeworms are receiving all the benefit of nutrients within the whale's digestive system, and this is only negatively impacting the whales. The whales do not get benefit, and in fact, they do not get to take advantage of all of the resources that they are consuming because of these tapeworms. And occasionally, parasites can result in illness and even death. Now, rarely is it the goal of the parasites to cause immediate death of its host, unless it's simply an intermediate host and the parasite is using it to get to another host. But the parasite benefits as long as its host remains alive. So in talking about cases of mutualism, where both members of this symbiosis benefit, well, these symbioses can be facultative, in which the partners receive benefits together, however, they can potentially live separate from each other. Or it can be an obligate symbiosis. An obligate symbiosis is when a partner could not survive without their other partners. In all cases, it's the smaller partner that is known as the symbiont, while the larger partner is the host. And here in this image, we see a moray eel at a cleaning station. The eel is receiving benefit because smaller fish are eating parasites off the surface of its skin. The smaller fish are receiving benefit in that they're being fed, and also the moray eel is not here aggressively. They aren't under threat by the moray eel at this point. So this is an example of a mutualistic symbiotic association. Predation is entirely different. In predation, it's the predator who benefits at the expense of the prey. In predation, one species, the predator, kills another, the prey, for food. Prey species often have adaptations that help them to avoid being eaten, such as warning coloration, camouflage, or mimicry. In herbivory, an animal is consuming a plant. So the organism, which we call an herbivore, and we extend the definition to include both seaweeds and algae as well. The herbivore eats that seaweed or that plant. And so in essence, they are preying upon a non-animal organism. An ecosystem is all of the living, biotic, and non-living, abiotic components in a particular area. So the community and the abiotic factors together make up the ecosystem. While we identify ecosystems as a group, neighboring ecosystems can interact with each other. All ecosystems require a constant input of energy. And as we'll see, chemicals and nutrients are cycled within and between ecosystems. And that completes our introduction of how species interact with each other. Now, in our next video, we're going to talk about energy flow and nutrient cycles. And have you ever wondered how you could be more efficient? Well, we'll talk about that in the next video.